This segment discusses one of the most prominent components of U.S. foreign policy during the Trump administration, the trade war between the United States and China. President Trump has remained highly critical of this trading relationship since he first launched his candidacy for the presidency. Arguably, his position on trade and bringing back manufacturing jobs to the United States was one of the main reasons he was able to capture the decisive states of Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan, which propelled his election in November of 2016. In an effort to change what he sees as an unfair trade relationship between the two largest economies of the world, President Trump began to negotiate new terms of trade with China at the beginning of his term in 2017. However, these negotiations stalemated, and President Trump adopted a confrontational approach to gain concessions from China centered around tariffs. The escalating tensions and tit-for-tat increases of tariffs between the two countries erupted into a full-fledged trade war. This trade war has included multiple rounds of tariff increases by both that have slowed trade between them. A slight pause appeared to emerge in January of 2020 with the successful completion of a phase one trade deal between the two countries. However, the crises associated with the COVID-19 pandemic threatened to undermine that progress. This segment will provide an overview of this trade conflict in a series of steps. First, we begin with a video produced by The Economist in November of 2019 that introduces some of the most prominent dimensions of this conflict. Second, we describe some of the political and ideological foundations of President Trump's economic policies, particularly with respect to international trade. Third, we discuss some of the primary stages in this trade war, including the phase one deal in January of 2020. Then we briefly conclude by speculating about how the COVID-19 pandemic might again alter the course of this globally important trading relationship. So let's go ahead and turn to that first video clip now.
The world's leading superpowers are locking horns.
Game on here. A trade war between the United States and China is here.
Over the past 16 months, America and China have been trading blows through tariffs on goods.
We are looking at a reality that has, a 25% tariff on every single product that would come in from China.
The impact is being felt on industries worldwide. But what is the story behind the America-China trade war?
So, the trade war, what have you guys been looking at?
The U.S. doesn't like that China is growing so fast and set to overtake America as like the biggest economy in the world if it hasn't already by certain measures, right?
Basically, China and US are kind of caught in this race of imposing tariffs on each other. So US slaps a high tariff on certain products and then China retaliates.
It's multiple industries across multiple markets. It's huge. And I think right now would be a really good time to look at what's happened and how it could impact the world from now on.
At The Economist, we've been covering the trade war extensively. Sumaya Keynes is our trade and globalization editor, based in Washington, D.C.
How did this whole trade war kick off? How did this whole trade war start?
For a long time, there have been frustrations that past American administrations had with the Chinese. On the 2016 presidential campaign trail, you started to see some really tough rhetoric.
We can't continue to allow China to rape our country, and that's what they're doing.
And so he gets into office, his United States trade representative, that's the kind of official trade negotiator, they're working on this big report. So they're essentially investigating China's economic practices. Essentially, the question they're asking is, has China done anything that would frustrate America's economic interests? And they find, surprise, surprise, yes.
How long a history is there of these complaints the U.S. has about China?
These concerns go back for a really long time. And I think to understand them properly, you really need to go way back to the expectations that people had when China was thinking about entering the World Trade Organization.
China's economic rise has been dramatic. In 1978, China's GDP at market prices was just 6% of America's. Last year, it had grown to 66%. When considering local spending power, China has already overtaken America. This unprecedented growth began with Deng Xiaoping. He started opening up China's economy to the world in 1978 and the country quickly became the world's factory. Over the next decade, exports as a share of GDP tripled, and by 1988, 15% of China's exports went to America. The World Trade Organization opened its doors to China in 2001, and it was America that ushered it in.
Bringing China into the WTO is a win-win decision. It will protect our prosperity, and it will promote the right kind of change in China.
After joining the WTO, China became an economic superpower. But people had expected the country to also become more like a Western capitalist economy. That didn't happen. America now claims that China achieved its growth by not playing fair. Are those claims justified? To find out the answer, I spoke with David Rennie. He's our Beijing bureau chief.
There's two ways in which China certainly hasn't been playing fair. One way is just that China treats Chinese companies differently. So if you are a Western business, your Chinese competitor not only has better market access, but maybe the land that it built its factory on was given for free. Maybe it got a giant tax break. China just doesn't have a level playing field. There's then the really dirty stuff, stealing foreign companies' technology. If you ask Chinese officials about the accusation that China is stealing its way to the top, they'll say, well, hang on, America steals secrets too, so why are you coming after us? The American government will tell you, sure, they spy and they steal stuff, but never for commercial purposes. With Donald Trump's election in 2016, you had a president who actually set about getting tough with China once he was in office, and we'd never really had that before.
Okay, so this video provides a good introduction to some of the deeper issues that have triggered this trade conflict between China and the United States. We see that the election of President Trump prompted a reorientation in U.S. grand strategy and trade policy that helped to escalate this conflict. At the same time, we should recognize that this trade dispute reflects a deeper set of structural factors associated with China's economic rise and a fundamental contrast between the political and economic systems of the two countries. As we have discussed before, rapid Chinese economic growth could provoke a much larger transformation in the global distribution of power that works to undermine American hegemony. Additionally, this discussion about unfair trading practices and too much government support for Chinese firms reflects the significant differences between how the two economies are managed. The Chinese economy is a managed capitalist system with high levels of government ownership of critical economic resources. In relative terms, the U.S. government plays a more limited role in managing the U.S. economy and supporting firms and industries. These differences in domestic economic institutions trigger U.S. concerns that Chinese practices could unfairly harm U.S. businesses competing in the global economy. Okay, so let's step back and ask why the administration, the Trump administration that is pursuing these policies. First, we need to return to Trump's grand strategy of America First. He has long argued that the rest of the world has been taking advantage of the United States for decades. The U.S. provides security through military alliances, but is not compensated fairly, and these countries don't spend enough on national defense. Moreover, the trade component of these alliances is also unfair. The U.S. runs trade deficits with many of these countries. This means the U.S. imports more from these countries than it exports to them. More broadly, such views reflect a broader political interest in redefining U.S. trading relationships with most countries in the world, but particularly with China. And note here as well how President Trump's views on trade and free riding by other countries around the world also provide a foundation for confronting the broader strategic challenges associated with China's rise. In effect, he is arguing that globalization has fueled China's rise and weakened the United States. Consequently, the U.S. should alter its trading relationship with China.
Second, as you might imagine, President Trump holds a deeper skepticism about the benefits of free trade policies. He believes that these free trade policies have led to the movement of American manufacturing jobs to other countries. U.S. firms set up their manufacturing operations in other countries to take advantage of lower labor costs then. Then these U.S. firms export their goods from the overseas factories to American consumers because these goods can enter the American economy without tariffs. He argues that these economic practices reduce or eliminate American jobs. So his support for protectionism is designed to make that corporate strategy less feasible. President Trump wants more American firms to locate all or most of their operations on U.S. soil. Note that these economic beliefs are also consistent with President Trump's broader domestic political strategy, first to win the presidency in 2016, and then to retain the presidency in the November 2020 elections. Protection and support for manufacturing jobs works to strengthen political support for Trump among key constituencies in swing states like Michigan, Ohio, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. Third, we need to talk some about the specifics of the administration's trade demands with respect to China. In part to help offset the trade deficit, President Trump wants China to increase their purchases of U.S. exports, particularly agricultural exports. He wants the Chinese government to do more to protect the intellectual property rights of American companies and inventors, such as through greater respect for copyright privileges held by U.S. firms. These demands also include reducing the capacity of Chinese firms to force U.S. firms to make technology transfers as part of joint ventures with companies in China. The U.S. government also wants the Chinese government to commit to a stable exchange rate policy that does not use the competitive devaluation of the Chinese currency relative to the dollar to push Chinese exports up by making them cheaper to U.S. consumers.
So the president focuses on the trade deficit as a scorecard to evaluate the relative fairness of the trade policies with the rest of the world. Consequently, he wants the Chinese government to work with the U.S. government to reduce the bilateral deficit in trade between the two countries. Trump wants to offset this trade deficit by cutting imports from the target country, China in this case. And he wants to cut imports by raising the price of these goods in the United States. And he can raise the price of these goods in the United States by raising tariffs on Chinese products. The broader hope here is that these punitive tariffs will pressure China to alter its trade policy with the United States. And the logic is that China cannot afford to be left out of the American consumer market. The administration expects the Chinese government to make trade concessions in a way that simultaneously cuts Chinese exports to the U.S. while creating new opportunities for American firms to increase their exports into China. Next, we want to get into some more of the details of the trade war between the United States and China. And to do that, we return to another segment of that video from The Economist.
The Trump administration has been using tariffs, or taxes on imported goods, to try to force the Chinese to change their ways. In July 2018, America imposed tariffs of 25% on $34 billion worth of Chinese products. That almost doubled the average tariff rate on Chinese imports, from 3.8% to 6.7%. And it's American firms that have to pay that tax. But with every increase from America came an increase from China. Since the start of the trade war, China has more than doubled its average tariff rate. America's has tripled. The fight has become overtly political because China's tariffs are hitting President Trump's voter base. Many counties where Trump won in the 2016 election were here, in the Great Plains. And these are the counties most affected by China's tariffs. Someone who knows all about the impact tariffs are having beyond the data is Chad Bown from the Peterson Institute for International Economics. He's been analyzing international trade for decades, but the trade war has put his research in the spotlight.
Some people have referred to it as my World Cup or my Super Bowl. It's something that I've been studying in the background for 20 years, and now all of a sudden the world seems to be interested in this.
What role do tariffs play in a trade war?
Tariffs are basically a tax, but it's a tax that's only paid for goods that are produced outside of the country in a specific place. One of the things that China has done in its tariffs is it's imposed really high tariffs on American exports of soybeans. This is a huge product that farmers in Iowa and across the Midwest grow only to sell to China.
So how are these tariffs and the trade war impacting the wider world economy?
I think at some level, we're seeing the decisions that businesses make be affected by this. Nowadays, they're not sure what markets are going to be open to them in the future, and that's going to impact their investment decisions. The International Monetary Fund, the IMF, they expect economic growth to be a lot lower in the future because of the tensions arising during the trade war. The global economy is slowing down, and everybody's increasingly concerned about that.
So we want to highlight a few things from this clip. First, let's look at the visual displayed on your slide here. It charts how the average tariff rates that each country imposes on imports from the other has changed over the past few years. We can essentially see 4 escalating rounds here in the trade war between China and the United States. The first in July of 2018, the second in the fall of 2018, another in June of 2019, and a fourth in the fall of 2019. These tariffs have been applied to a wide range of goods sold out of each country, including agricultural exports like soybeans, raw materials, iron, steel, machinery, cars, and other finished products. Most importantly, these tariffs have reduced trade between the two countries and, importantly, raised consumer prices in both countries. Second, we want to highlight the reciprocal and escalating nature of this trade war. Both sides have repeatedly responded to tariff increases with a new round of tariff increases. Third, note the strategic nature of these retaliatory tariffs, particularly with respect to how China has targeted certain sectors of the US economy. So as the next slide here shows, the Chinese government has intentionally targeted sectors and regions of the United States economy that are more likely to vote for President Trump. The darker red colors on this slide indicate those counties in the United States that have been most hurt by Chinese tariffs. And these colors disproportionately fall in red states that traditionally vote for Republicans. In other words, the Chinese government is trying to pressure Trump voters into supporting an alternative candidate. China hopes to leverage elections in the United States to pressure Trump into making concessions in the trade war.
So it's important to realize that this relationship was improving just before the outbreak of COVID-19. The Trump administration and China signed a phase 1 trade deal in January of 2020 that eased access for American exports into China. Most importantly, the president was going to rely on this trade deal success to spark higher levels of economic growth in the United States and sell this agreement as a significant political and economic victory during the presidential campaign of 2020. Let's quickly watch a PBS video that summarizes the progress made in US-China relations just before the coronavirus outbreak.
After more than 2 years of escalating threats, tariffs, and trade wars, the U.S. and China signed a new trade deal today. As Nick Schifrin tells us, it is known as phase 1 of a potentially larger deal. But the administration, critics, and businesses all say it is crucial to make sure that it's enforced and that the reality matches the rhetoric.
Today, the world's 2 largest economies declared a partial truce.
Our efforts have yielded a transformative deal that will bring tremendous benefits to both countries. We have a great relationship with China.
Standing next to China's top negotiator, President Trump predicted the deal would begin fundamental reforms to China's economy.
This is the biggest deal anybody's ever seen, and it can lead to being a deal that's unprecedented because China has 1.5 billion people. And ultimately, in phase 2, we're going to be opening up China to all of your companies.
Under the deal, China agrees to purchase $200 billion over the next 2 years of U.S. agriculture, energy, manufacturing, and financial services. And the administration says China promised to protect U.S. companies' intellectual property, stop forcing American companies to transfer technology to access Chinese markets, and lift financial service barriers. But China has pledged many of those reforms before and has a history of failing to buy as much as it promises. Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer has supported the administration's China policy goals, but says this agreement failed to go far enough.
The agreement does not address the Chinese government's massive subsidies to support domestic industries, devastating global markets, and eroding American competitiveness.
For months, the Trump administration and China have targeted each other with tariffs that hurt the Chinese economy and U.S. farmers and raise some consumer prices. As part of the deal, the U.S. reduced some tariffs, but maintained most of the tariffs on hundreds of billions of dollars of goods already imposed. President Trump said those tariffs and new enforcement language would guarantee that China won't break its promises.
We have full, again, the word, one of the strongest things we have, total and full enforceability. And you know what that means. Total, full enforceability.
Reaching a bigger agreement depends on how both countries follow through. President Trump said today he expects further negotiations to begin next month. For the PBS NewsHour, I'm Nick Schifrin.
Okay, so it looks like we have real progress in the U.S.-China relations with the completion of Phase 1 trade pact in January of 2020. And then the COVID-19 panic hits, changes the world, and raises deeper challenges for the U.S.-China relationship and the Trump administration. Back in January of 2020, President Trump had planned on using the trade deal as a critical component of his re-election strategy. He was going to tout it as both an economic and political success that would provide economic gains to the United States in the form of greater exports to China, and a political success. Trump could say that he scored a political win by extracting concessions from China that might even work to temper China's rise in the long run. The COVID pandemic has made it harder to rely on this trade agreement as strengthening the United States in the long run. U.S. public opinion toward the Chinese government grew significantly more negative in the spring of 2020. And as of May 2020, China had a lot of ground to cover in fulfilling its pledges to increase its purchases of U.S. exports as part of the Phase 1 trade agreement.